interaction to understand how social or how professional or how casual you should be, which can be kind of a difficult line to walk sometimes, I know, especially with something like comics where it's a lot of people who are kind of trying to turn a hobby into a career. I know that can be like a really, really tricky thing, but it's something that is important to keep in mind. To further that, as I was saying, like, be passionate. Don't be afraid to tweet about stuff that you just like. I spent years tweeting about Frankenstein because I like Frankenstein. When the 200th anniversary rolled around, I had publishers reaching out to me to just give me advanced copies of books related to Frankenstein that they had. I ended up doing a whole zine about it that started because of Twitter, the tweets I made. But you'll be able to find situations like that for yourself as well. Like, if you really love Transformers or something, talk about that. Yeah, there are other people out there who love that same stuff, and if you say, hey, I want to make my own robot story, there's probably someone else who's like, heck yeah, I want to work with you on that robot story. So just be genuine and be yourself, which extends also to, like, don't be afraid to share fan art. There's a lot of people online who will make hashtags around it. The example I gave was people drawing themselves and their Pokemon, which was like really popular last year, I think. But again, you can show your quality as an artist, but also just the things that you're interested in, which can make people start to think of you when they have projects that are related to your interests. I'd recommend, once you're a little bit more comfortable on social media, experimenting with programs like Buffer, TweetDeck, Hootsuite. If you don't know what any of those are, they all serve more or less the same function. They're all ways that you can schedule tweets, and they'll have analytics for how much people are engaging with those. So you can get an idea of like how often you should post, at what times you should post, that kind of thing. So if you just want to throw up a ton of posts about your webcomic updating, or you want to tweet in the morning and then make it automatically retweet a few more times in the day, those programs can be really useful for that. Another thing, everyone's busy. We all know this. We all have lives. Editors are busy. If you send someone an email, don't bother them about it on social media. They may be taking time, like they may have a million reasons that they haven't gotten back to it yet, as much as we would like them to be prompt. But this is something I see people do all the time around anthologies, especially. They'll bug me about their pitches before the submissions have even closed, which doesn't leave a great impression. So yeah, just use Twitter for what it's for, which is, you know, sharing your work and giving midnight thoughts about the anime that you're binging. And I would also say, if you're able to, update your portfolio every few months. If you've got new work you can throw in there, it's really, it's a good idea to keep things as current as you can. The main things that need to go in your portfolio, like it's not a portfolio if you don't have your contact info, sequential samples, and a list of things that you worked on. Those things are key. I can't hire you without one of those things, or without all three of those things. But it's also, if you have social media world links, that's great. As I said, I can use Instagram to see what your most recent work looks like. If you work in color, include that if you want to get work in color, but it's not essential. If you just want to do pencils and inks, then that's fine. I can still tell what your storytelling looks like. An illustration can be handy just because it's, you might have like tonal variety. If you've got a web comic that's like all ages, accessible, you know, like sci-fi or something, but you also might be interested in horror, for example, and you've got a couple horror pinups that you can include. That just lets me see what other kinds of things you can do. If you do not have a portfolio, I would recommend Portfolio Box. It's what I use for my website. It would be akin to the Squarespace. If we listen to podcasts, we all know about Squarespace. Portfolio Box is a version of that that's a lot cheaper. They have actually some free options as well. You'll end up with like a weird URL with extra letters in it, but it will be free, and you can put up your art there, and they are like specifically geared towards artists. Behance, I don't think is very expensive either. A lot of people use that. But there are a lot of options that you can use where you do not have to break the bank, and you can still get all your work up there. So that's what I'd recommend, but you can also do other research, obviously. On the topic of sequential samples, If you don't have a ton and you don't have a story that you want to tell, like there's a webcomic is a great option, but like that's a huge time commitment, and if you don't want to go into that, you could make something smaller like a zine, but again, if that's not your option, if you'd rather just draw other people's scripts, you may find a friend who's a writer. There are so many people online who are writers and are looking for collaborators. I'll get into that in a few slides, but you could work with someone who has a script, draw that script. I would also recommend looking up Comics Experience, has a script archive. A bunch of writers have donated scripts, and the intention is to show people what script writing looks like. But it's a really good resource if you're like, hey, here's 4 pages of someone's Batman story that I took and now we'll draw. Because again, all I want to see is that you know how to tell a story. That's what matters to me as an editor. So even if you're using, it's free online, so you can use it. And that's, again, just a good way to get some sequentials up there if you don't want to commit to writing and drawing something longer. Now, a lot of our networking is going to be in person. So we're going to talk about small talk. You all live in Toronto or near Toronto, I presume, if you're here tonight, which means you are extremely lucky. There are events going on all the time through the Beguiling and Page and Panel. Like they do book launches, they do talks, they do these kinds of things all the time. Any comic book shop in the city, in fact, will do signings where you can meet people. I've done that. But there's also things like all of the conventions that happen, and the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, while the festival is only 2 days, is like a week and a half long at this point with all the events that they do. So those are great ways to go and meet people in person, and sometimes that in-person connection makes a huge difference. One of the key things when you are talking to someone and you don't know what to say, ask them a question. Which may seem obvious, you might just, oh, what are you working on? We're both in comics. But it's important to try to listen to what they're actually saying and try to continue the conversation. Sometimes it's going to feel really unrewarding because they're not going to be responding to you with a lot of questions or interest in your work, which always feels terrible. But at least you got a little bit of practice. But when they do, usually most folks will ask you in response about your work. And as I said, it's imperative that you know about your own work, can talk about your own work in a way that isn't self-deprecating and isn't apologetic. If you're apologizing and you're not confident in your work, no one else has any reason to be. So don't be afraid to talk about things that you like, even if it means you don't have a project on the go right now, but you're like, hey, I'm an artist, I love horror and I love drawing unicorns, or I love drawing mermaids, or whatever. I love drawing girls kissing, that's fine. You may be able to find that you have a common interest with someone, so that's a great thing that you can talk about as well. If you're at, do people know what I mean when I say BarCon? It's kind of it's a nickname people apply when after a convention, there's usually 1 or 2 hotels where all the guests are staying, and the bar, the lobby bar at that hotel is a second convention. You hear a lot of stories about BarCon being the real place where the networking happens. I know Megan wants to talk about later about networking at conventions. But if you've ever done a convention, you probably know it can be really, really tough to get to know people if you're stuck behind a table. So something like the BarCon is a really good opportunity to actually talk to people and be social. And even if it's not that, if you go to a convention or you know other people who are going, people are doing dinners, they're doing coffees, they're doing breakfasts, they're doing all kinds of things. And these more social events don't put the pressure of having to hand out business cards and talk about yourself. You can just be a genuine person. And sometimes it's in my experience, this has been a much more fruitful way to get jobs. My first editing gig was with Jason Liu, who does The Pitiful Human Lizard, a Toronto-based superhero comic. We met at a convention because we were both dressed as Multiple Man. And we walked around together and people thought that was very funny, and that's how we became friends. And he asked me to work with him. I met Chip through him, who I'm working with now. And then I got on with the Toronto Comics Anthology because I met the publisher of that at a dinner after a different anthology signing. And it wasn't like we were necessarily, looking for work and changing business cards or anything like that, but we got talking about comics that we were both interested in both cases, and you express your interest, they express that they're looking for someone, that's how you find it. And so I think that those events, while they're not as like formal networking in the way that you think about it necessarily, they lead to the most fruitful collaboration. I recommend having business cards in your wallet with you at all times. Again, if you're in a social situation, you might not necessarily be exchanging them. Like a lot of people now just pull out your phone and say, hey, what's your Twitter handle? Which may feel a lot more natural. If you're wondering how to ask for it or give someone your business card, or I just ask for theirs first. So if I ask for someone's card, they just kind of expect that I'll hand it to them in response. So rather than just being like, hey, you want this, and throw it at them like Gambit, just ask them first for theirs, and they'll probably just reach for yours instinctively. And if you don't have cards, again, just like most of us have smartphones now, just ask for their Twitter or their Instagram or whatever, and you can follow each other that way. If you do meet someone that way, especially if it's an editor or someone you really want to work with, it's nice to follow up. If it's a more casual social thing, sometimes just a case of like, tweeting at them, hey, it was really cool to meet you. I often try to make some reference to something we talked about. Like I remember meeting Tess Stone at TCAF a few years ago. We were talking about ghost hunting shows, so I tweeted something about ghost adventures, I think. It was silly, but if you follow up with just a little thing to jog their memory about who you are, that can be really helpful. Because if it's someone who's more famous, in scare quotes, they've probably met a lot of people in a weekend or at an event, and if you follow up with a response like that, then they might have a better chance of remembering who you are. And similar to that, if you meet new people and you meet a ton of people and you get a business card, write on the card who that person was. If you are like, this is the person I talked about Sailor Moon with for half an hour, then you'll know who that is later on when you're going through all your business cards. If you're at a show for a weekend and you collect 100 of them, this can be a really useful way to remember, just jog your own memory about the people that you've met. If possible, a networking buddy is really useful. This is someone who can trade you off to people that you meet throughout the night. So if I'm out with Megan and I'm talking to an editor at a publisher she wants to work with, and I can kind of grab her and go, oh, you're looking for artists. I have this friend who's really loves the Ninja Turtles, and you have that property. And then I can introduce her and she can do the same. The other thing that tactic can also work if you are at the end of a conversation that you don't want to be having anymore. You can find the person in the room that you like the least and pass them off to whoever you're talking to. But if that doesn't work, you can also just do a quick, it was really great to meet you, thank you for your time, things like that, because we've all got stuck talking to someone who just won't stop talking, or you have to use the bathroom or something. Just ending it on a positive note can be a really good way to just exit yourself from a situation, which I know as an awkward person is always the hardest part for me. So when you sense the end of an interaction coming, it's just oh, well, it was great to meet you, thank you so much, and then just, you can, yeet out of there. So just to kind of wrap up a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about pitching to anthologies, because I know most of you are probably a little bit newer in your careers. As I said, I think that they're one of the best ways to get more experience. You can do things like a webcomic or make your own zines. Those are also invaluable, but an anthology is great because it can give you experience working with a team, working with collaborators. It can introduce you to potential future collaborators, which is really helpful. And it's also a little bit less, lower pressure. If you have 6 or 8 pages, that's different than being hired to do a 22-page comic, or going right off the bat to someone's graphic novel, which some of us know is not the ideal way to go when you're a new creator.
Why are you looking at me? Stop looking at me.
Yeah, Megan can tell you those stories another time. Yeah, start with anthologies. The best way to get into an anthology, if you're wondering where to find them, the internet these days. Sometimes you can find out about them at conventions. I know with TO Comics Press, we'll sometimes have like business cards that we'll hand out about anthologies that are coming up. That's not that uncommon. But if you're not able to get to a bunch of events, there are a bunch of Facebook groups. If you just look for like comic book writers and artists and things like that, there are a ton of groups that are looking to hook up writers and artists that are looking to collaborate. As I mentioned, there are also those hashtags. There's always hashtags on Twitter. There's a Reddit community called Comic Book Collabs. I'm sure many of you share my skepticism about Reddit in general, but I know a lot of people that have found like little anthologies to work in through Reddit that have been like ended up being really good projects. So I only recommend it because I know people who've like had success that way. If you're on Twitter, Paper Cat Blog and Anthology Comics are two Twitter accounts that are dedicated to just tweeting out about anthologies that are looking for people. So those are great follows. If you're on Twitter, I'd really recommend those ones. As I mentioned also, it's really good to keep your portfolio site updated. I just really want to hammer that home because there are so many talented illustrators that I've come across who want to work in comics, but whose work is old or not sequential. And again, I really want you to get jobs, so please make sure your portfolio is updated. I'll give you a quick second if you're copying down the URLs, but the next thing I want to talk about is like the act of actually pitching, since a lot of you said especially that you're interested in writing and maybe pitching as writers to anthologies or to like write your own stories. It's really important, I think, to look at some do's and don'ts that are based on my experience, and I also consulted with Stephen Andrews, the publisher of Toronto Comics Press, as well as Stephanie Cook, who runs a website called Creator Resource and is like a huge just resource for people in the city. And these are just some very common mistakes that we have found. So, as I've said a few times, don't apologize or be overly self-deprecating. This is something I see a lot in the bios section of pitches. For example, I know I had, you'll get a lot of people who will focus on the fact that they don't have any experience, and that'll be the whole bio, which doesn't tell me anything about you. It's really important, but you want to make sure that you just make yourself seem fun to work with. Be like, hey, this seems like I'm a little less experienced, but these are the things that I like doing. This is what I have made. So I have graduated from Maxima where I did X, Y, and Z in my classes. That's fine. And you could tell them, for example, that you're really passionate about the theme of the anthology or the subject of the anthology, but you want to make sure that you're focusing on the positives, and even if you don't have like a long CV to show off, there are still a lot of positive things that you can focus on in a bio that'll make you seem like a more interesting and authentic collaborator. Follow the submission guidelines. This is, again, one of those things that seems obvious, but you'll get things like people who will submit a story that doesn't really fit the theme of the anthology. I find that really frequently. If you had a story idea that's kind of related to my theme and you pitch it, I can tell. My last anthology that I'm working on right now, the theme is about monsters and families, and I get pitches that didn't have monsters in them. And it was like, okay, I know that this is just something you've been sitting on, and I'm not going to be that interested in it if you're just throwing it at me. And it doesn't fit my theme, so I'm definitely not going to take it. But there's also process things you'll be asked about. So as I said, if I say the submission deadline is June 1st, and we'll get back to people a week after that, don't be emailing me in the middle of May asking me about your pitch. I'm not going to answer you. As I mentioned before, don't bug your editor on social media. It's a related thought. Again, make sure that you send us sequential samples. Don't leave the ending a mystery. This is something people like to do as well. In the pitch for the story, you get a lot of folks who want to, I guess they want to make it like the back of a book or the like movie synopsis or something where they'll only tell you about the first half of the story or like the interesting action. But in a pitch, I want to know the beginning, middle, and end. It's very important that I know what the whole story is going to look like, because if I don't, I might not take a chance on it. I might not think the ending is as strong as you do, or I can't get a sense of how long it's supposed to be, for example. Sometimes we'll get people with a really simple story. They'll say they need 12 pages, and I go, no, you're going to do it in 6. which for a number of reasons I might want to do. And if you don't give me your full story, I can't get a sense of how many pages this is going to take in my book, and I can't take that risk that you're going to go way over, and that's going to affect my my published book at the end of the day. And finally, be concise. If I'm reading 400 pitches, and I was for Wayward Kindred, I don't want to read a 12-paragraph opus about a 10-page comic. It's, get me your beginning, middle, and end, get enough detail, know that there's some flavor, that I can see your personality, that kind of thing's important. But try to limit it to, 3 paragraphs tops, but like 1 paragraph is better if you can. It's really important, and the bio is the same way. I've had some really long-winded bios, and sometimes the person's bio, I have to admit, is just so insufferable that I don't want to work with them, and it doesn't matter how good their story is. I had someone who called himself a future Eisner Award-winning writer, and I was like, no. But you see what I mean? It's just not appealing to work with. So in both, in any section where you're given space to give multiple paragraphs, just try to keep it tight. Find the balance between enough detail and not going way overboard. Yes?
Oh, sorry, I know you said
No, of course.
leave it to Q&A, but so basically just don't be grandiose about yourself, just be...
Yeah, I think just be genuine. My bio, for example, the one that I always use, I'll start out and say, I'm a freelance comics editor, Frankenstein aficionado, and lover of dogs. And then I go into a list, here's 2 or 3 anthologies I did and 2 or 3 series that I did. And when I first started out, I would just be a little heavier on the, stuff that I like. People often include, where they live or something about their pet, for example. But you don't need to pad it out too much in a bio. You're just, 3 or 4 sentences tells me everything I need to know. And there's things, too, if someone's submitting me a story about, the metaphor, for example, I have a story in the new anthology about a character who's a vampire, half vampire, half human, and also one parent is black, one parent is white. And so in this bio saying I'm a black writer is important for me to know, because you're going to have an insight into that someone else isn't, or saying I'm a mixed race writer, for example. So sometimes that kind of stuff, your identity things, can be important to get into if it's relevant to your story. And it's not always, and of course no one has to volunteer information that they don't want to. I don't want to give you that impression. But there's things like that can tell me about the kind of experience that you have, the kind of insights you might have to whatever story you're telling. But I would say, do, if you can, 3 sentences, one that tells me about your, just you as a person, a cutesy, fun one that makes you seem like a human and not a CV. And then 2 sentences that go into more your work. So one could be about series or zines or whatever you worked on, and then a final one on having graduated from here or something like that. As a vague guideline, you don't have to follow that exactly, but yeah, you want to find a balance between seeming friendly and seeming fun and seeming interesting, because if you just give me a list, I can't necessarily get a huge sense of who you are and what you'd be like to collaborate with, but you also don't want to go way over the top. I'm the person that you're gonna hire for these reasons. It's also a little off-putting. But does that answer your question? Is that a little clearer, maybe?
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. But yeah, so this actually gets into what I was just talking about. When you're talking about yourself, whether it's in a bio, on your website, or on Twitter, or anywhere else, if you feel like I think it's easy for us when we're really early in our careers to feel like we're not quite there yet, right? We all wish that we had 9 different things that we could list, and all of these accolades and awards that we could tell people that we've won, but sometimes we don't. Everyone has to start somewhere, and so if you don't have a bunch of things you can list, credits to your name, try to think about other transferable skills that you might be able to talk about. When I was first starting out, I used to work as an administrator, which I was lucky happens to translate really well to my editorial work. But for a long time, I emphasized that when I had 2 comics to my name, I was I did this, but I used to be an admin where I did X, Y, and Z, which is relevant. So if there are things that you've done that might impact your work, that affect your storytelling, even if it's just experience that you've had that is relevant to things that you're exploring in your work, think like there are a lot of ways that you can talk about yourself and your work that isn't just a list of credits. And you are also as a person are not a list of credits. You want to sell yourself when you're networking and when you're trying to find people to work with. And so anything you can do to make yourself seem interesting, seem friendly, seem approachable, that's all the kind of stuff you want to emphasize. Like you want people to know who you are as much as you want them to like be able to look at your art. But on top of that, you want to make sure that you're staying professional when it's necessary. Again, I can't tell you the number of times I've gotten like really casual responses to really formal business emails and been really turned off by that. And anthologies, as I said, can be really good to get like a thing on your resume, but they can also introduce you to future collaborators. With Wayward Sisters, we had like a really cute thing where people, because it was a monster theme anthology, we had people's like little avatars in their bios. A lot of people used monster images, and people who didn't have them were like asking other artists in the book to draw those for them. And I think a couple people have like gone on to like work on little projects together and stuff. So if you are lucky enough to get into an anthology, I'm sure you're all talented enough, that can be a great way to meet people that you might want to work with in the future. So I stress again, I think those are really beneficial. But so can things like dinners and that sort of thing. So you know, try to make friends rather than make like business contacts a lot of the time with networking, especially like if you're not in a situation where people are like expressly exchanging business cards. And then yeah, any work shows what you can do, but it also shows you can get things done. And to an editor, sometimes that's the most important thing. The fact that you can hit deadlines is huge. That's one of the first things I ask about when I'm looking for someone for like a longer project. I'll ask their other collaborators, like, did they submit things on time? Do they do the work? Because that's just as important as your talent. If you are a phenomenal artist, but you're known for not getting me things on time, there's a chance I'll hire someone else instead of you. So yeah, just getting work done shows that you can get work done, and that kind of stuff is really, really valuable. And I know that this was a whirlwind of a presentation. I know I threw a lot of info at you. I think this is being recorded. And I'm going to give you my contact info if you have any other questions that aren't addressed here tonight, or you want the slides, I can send them to you. This is a Nancy comic because I love Nancy that's vaguely related to editing. It's fine. But I think we're going to have a quick break, and then we'll talk questions, and if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer those as well. But as I said, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or whatever. I'm terminally online, so I'll get back to you pretty fast.